And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, Brian. It's early January or early almost February here, and life is
Yeah,
moving on. How about you? You guys have had a little bit of Arctic experience from all I saw in the news.
we did, and it's a little warmer now, so we've actually picked up a little bit of warmth. I just walked uh, to a doctor's office and back, and it was about 52 degrees, and it felt very, very warm in what I was wearing. I was thinking, oh, I overdressed for this, but I'm thrilled that it's warm. Hopefully, we'll stay warm for a little bit. It's all I can hope for. I know it's not going to happen, but I can hope.
Hey, you're doing a program, right?
Yes.
You got a workshop going on in April, is that right?
Yes. It was
Yeah.
we had planned on it in February, and due to unforeseen circumstances, things got shifted around, and that's okay. Gave us a little more time to prepare and to promote. We're doing a post rehab summit. It's going to be in Scottsdale, Arizona, at the
Awesome.
Firm Body Pilates, and it's a Pilates studio out there. And we're going to be covering pretty much everything you can think of when it comes to post rehabilitation, things that you're going to see, all the low back stuff that you and I have talked about, in the past, and knees and hips and shoulders, you name it. We're going to cover it. Basically, talking about things like contraindications. First of all, what you're not supposed to do, then what you should do, and then progressions from there. So basically, just to give the trainer and Pilates instructor an idea and a roadmap of what to do when a client comes into them who has a condition that they haven't seen before. And, they've been released from PT, and it's sort of like, now what do I do? And you're like, okay, here's what you do. Here's how you can handle this. So yeah, it's going to be the 12th and 13th of April, and it's in
Awesome.
Scottsdale, Arizona. So if anybody is interested, check out the show notes or go to the Firm Body Pilates .com, and there'll be a link in their heading for Post Rehab Summit, and you can check it out there. And it's going to be
Oh,
12 CECs. So
awesome.
for a lot of people, that's a lot of CECs. That might get your whole annual amount of CECs in one fell swoop. So yeah, so I'm excited about that. That'll be a lot of fun.
Awesome. And I've got some advanced movement principles. Many of you know
Yeah.
I teach this course called Advanced Movement Principles, and I've got one coming up in Los Angeles in Studio City the second weekend of February on the lower body. The next weekend, also in Southern California in Arcadia, I'm doing one on the low back, but that's going to be actually in Chinese, translated into Chinese from one of our teachers down there. And then I'll also be doing a low back in Raleigh, North Carolina in April. So if you're
Nice.
interested in that, Pilates.com, Education Finder has an advanced movement principles tile. You can see all the courses there. So it's a great advanced course for those of you interested in all the things Brian just mentioned. Working with
Exactly.
issues, working with the
Working with
things beyond teaching exercises.
Yes, and something else, I'll be teaching at IDEA ACSM Summit in Denver. That's coming up in March. I
Awesome.
think it's the 7th is the day I'm going to be teaching a couple courses with anatomy in 3 dimensions, one on the knee and one on the upper body, different conditions. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the scapula. So you can check me out there if you're going to happen to be there. So yeah, we've got a lot coming up, you and I. This is good.
It's going to be a busy year. Yeah, and then I'll be at
It's going
Pilates
to
on
be.
Tour Denver the same weekend, right? Or the second weekend
Yeah,
second weekend, I think, in March.
I think you're there
So I can check that
next
out
weekend.
too. And the
I,
weekend after that, yeah. So
I think
check
like
that
we
out
did
too.
in San Francisco, we're going to be passing in the airport again,
Boom,
waving to each
boom.
other. Hi.
Exactly. Woo! All
Well,
right.
we've been covering a lot on the low back over the last, well, month and a half, 2 months. So we thought we'd kind of wrap things up. We did exercise progressions last time, but we thought, what might help people is to actually go through some case studies and say, okay, here's someone who existed. It's not theoretical. This is
Yeah.
not Mrs. Smith who has that. This is somebody who we saw. You saw someone, I saw someone, and here's what they presented. And here's, our train of thought. And I thought that'd be a great thing for us to discuss and go over and, see if the other person might do something differently or, give people an understanding of how our mind works when someone like that does come into our, facility. It's like, oh yeah, okay, here's some thoughts.
A little bit of clinical reasoning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
All
Exactly.
right.
So you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm going to start off with one that I see a lot of. Um, and this was a client. Go through as much of the history as I can. Late 40s, um, was a high-level professional, was actually owned a greeting card company. So did a lot of social things, super busy, super stressed, and had a lot of low back pain when they stood at all for any period of time, 5 minutes, and their low back would really start to hurt. Now they'd been to doctors, no obvious disc stuff, no obvious other things, but every time they stood, it's like their whole low back would ache, their legs would feel weak, and they would, just not feel comfortable. So in her case, what I really looked at was I started with posture, like why was she having such trouble standing? And that's not always the case, right? So a lot of times people have more pain sitting, so she had more pain standing. I was looking at her posture, and she was very posteriorly tilted in her pelvis. So when she stood, she was super posterior, kind of slumped. Her low back and her sacrum were just about flat when she was standing.
Oh, wow.
And I said, okay, so where is the pain when you're standing in that posture? And she pointed right to her sacroiliac joints. So it really wasn't central. It was more kind of like spread across the whole top of her pelvis, kind of from the low back across to the side joints. And I said, okay, so let's see what's happening here. As a little bit of a background, she also had psoriatic arthritis, which can cause some joint issues, kind of like rheumatoid arthritis, but not quite the same. So I wasn't sure if there was just some inflammation around those joints, which can happen with that. And one of the things that is really common in low back issues is pain that seems to center in the sacroiliac joints. Now, whether that's the key issue or not, chicken or egg, but there's often pain like on those two sides. So in her case, I played with, all right, well, thinking about this from my rational viewpoint. Oh, look, I have a skeleton right here. So, when I think about this, guys, if you're on YouTube, I got a little skeleton happening. Like I think about the sacroiliac joint, right, where the sacrum meets the ilium, and that joint can move a little bit, not a lot. It moves a little bit, and sometimes people, at least in my experience, will get irritated in one position. Like there's one plane in which the ilium and the sacrum meet that's like if it's got arthritis or it's got inflammation or something's going on. And sometimes if you just change that position slightly, they're getting force in a different part of that joint and it's not as uncomfortable. So in her case, we worked on two things. The first thing we worked on was just posture. So in her case, it was kind of simple. That's why I'm starting with this one. I basically said, okay, let's really work on having you stick your tail out when you stand. So essentially, we've talked about neutral spine forever. In her case, it was finding a neutral position in standing. And when she did that, it decreased her pain significantly, and she could tolerate standing for 4 or 5 times as long. Like before, it was about a 5-minute tolerance. This was more like a 30 to 45-minute tolerance.
Nice.
So that was, that was success, but that wasn't the whole answer, right? The other thing too that I noticed with her, and a lot of times when somebody really can posteriorly tilt like that, they're often, Brian and I both talked about this. They're just sinking into their ligaments. They're just hanging back and hanging on their ligaments. And there's not a lot of strength in the pelvis, in the low back, in the legs, in the thighs, in the hips to kind of pull that body together and support it in the optimum alignment. So our first step was just, let's play with posture. Let's find a slightly different neutral for you, especially when standing, and then let's strengthen in it. So then we did all kinds of things to strengthen the hips in all dimensions, footwork and feet and straps and standing work for the abductors and adductors, and did all of those with the back in what felt to her like a really dramatic lordosis. It wasn't, it was just a smaller lordosis, but it put force through a different part of her sacroiliac joints. And after about 3 months, she was able to really change her posture, increase her strength, increase the stability, especially in her standing of her whole core, and her pain level went way down and she could kind of carry on.
Nice.
So.
What's interesting is when you're describing that, all these questions came up in my mind. Immediately, I'm going to, okay, and I think you and I both have sort of checklists that it's like, okay, it's in standing. Okay, what kind of shoes is she wearing? What's the surface that she's standing on? So my mindset is immediately going to all of those things just as a to cross things off the list. Because if it's something
Yes.
as simple as, well, normally she wears sneakers, but for these events she wears 3-inch heels. Well, guess what?
Right.
That might be the cause. So let's eliminate some of the easy stuff. So for you, it was really about proprioceptively, she didn't know where her sacrum was in space. She had no
Right.
clue.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
just by making her aware of that and getting her to understand, hey, if we put this in a different place, if we just shift it a little bit, oh, that takes the pressure off, and that can make a huge difference in the body. It's like holding a bowling ball with arm out extended or close to the body. You really can change the amount of force that's being pushed through that joint. And you're able to obviously do that.
The other reason I use that example is typically when somebody is uncomfortable standing, most people when they're standing are in a deeper lordotic curve.
Yes.
Right, not everybody, but
Nope.
that's kind of typical. So typically if somebody has pain in standing, I'm often like, ooh, are they getting too much into extension and then
Mm-hmm.
compressing? That
Mm-hmm.
was not her situation, right? It was a different. So that's why I also brought that up, because you always have to look at what is happening for that client. Because all
Yes.
these things we've mentioned, and certainly if you go through any of our videos for advancing principles or anything, like we talk about some common situations, but that's not always what's happening. So
A-
always look like
yeah.
what's happening at all the points, and where is that force building up?
And this comes down to that, find the neutral spine that works for them.
Yes.
Because we're just going to say a generic situation that we've talked about before. Someone feels better sitting, not standing. Oh, so they need
Right.
to be in a posterior tilt in general. That's going to be their neutral spine, most likely to alleviate pain. However, she was already in a significant posterior tilt.
Yeah.
So for
Yep.
her, it was almost, she went too far, that you needed to actually work her into extension, which
Yep.
seems to be almost backwards from what a traditional, you know, looking at the body thinking, okay, she's not comfortable standing. She needs to be posteriorly tilted a little bit more because that makes her feel more comfortable. So it is looking at the body in front of you and not just
Yeah.
going with, the, forgive
The
me, but
rules.
a lot of medicine is sort of a flow chart. And they're
Yeah.
actually taught, a
Yeah.
lot of people are taught this. If yes, then do these. If no, then do
Right.
these.
Right.
And when you ask the question, how do you feel better, standing or sitting? Well, standing kills me. Oh, okay. So sitting. And if you follow all of that flow chart for her, it would not have worked. If you just did it without looking at her body. So you really had to look at her and say, okay, what's going on in the body in front of me, not the flow chart that's in the book.
One other thing too that sometimes shows up is just in general, it is much easier to work with a stiff body to move towards more mobility than to work
Mm-hmm.
with a lax body and move it more towards stability,
Yeah.
right? Because like the body wants efficiency, and efficiency often means hanging out on the ligaments, just like letting everything kind of collapse, the ligaments take the load. In her case, that was not optimum. She had to use more energy, more muscular strength to
Mm-hmm.
support her body in a way that wasn't that efficient in order to actually like decrease her pain.
Mm-hmm.
So, just a little point on there too.
And that's one reason why when we get people who have greater mobility, uh, I actually have another case study that I'll bring up a little later who I'm still seeing this client. It's very interesting. But when you have something that creates greater laxity in joints,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, whether it be pregnancy and relaxin or the other thing I was going to ask you is, okay, was it multiple pregnancies? Has she had 3 or 4 children? Because that can often have a little bit of a issue with joint laxity in the SI joint. So these are all questions, like I said, that immediately
Yeah.
I come to mind. That's like, okay, I'd ask this, I'd ask this, I'd ask this. So, just, doing that mental checklist in my brain too.
Yeah, and she had just done one, and it was a vaginal delivery. So that changes things too. So C-section. Anytime somebody has a C-section, I always look for a lot of things. A lot of times abdominals fall asleep,
Mm-hmm.
depending on like where the cut is. Like I've had women 4 years later who still can't feel their abdominals because just some nerve was cut in that process.
Exactly.
And sometimes that leads to low back pain because there just isn't the support in the front, scar tissues, all those things. So,
Mm-hmm.
but those
Mm-hmm.
those were not the situation in this case.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Well, I can throw a case study to you
Curveball.
that's an interesting curveball. And the reason
Yes.
I bring this one up is because, again, when we've talked about everything from stenosis to spondylolisthesis to disc herniations and whatnot, and a lot of times people think of them as being individual, and that a client's going to have one. And when they have one, it actually makes our job pretty easy because
A
it's
lot
like, oh,
easier.
okay, that's
Then,
easy.
then the rules generally apply, right? Yeah.
Precisely. And what I was thinking about this when I was teaching my course when I was in China a few weeks ago is I was teaching my spinal course. And in talking about it, I had to always bring up the fact that, okay, but if you have multiple conditions, you have to look deeper. You have to go beyond the basics and really, and that's really what I was teaching is trying to get people to, see a little more into, what's actually going on. So I had this
Yeah.
client, we're going to call her T, and she came to me. She was in her mid to late 60s, and a little Southern belle. She is I'm going to say tiny, sort of she takes good care of herself. Being in shape is something that she takes a lot of pride in. Okay. Think designing women, one of those Southern Belle type of people. And she said, I go for a walk every day. And when I hit mile number yes, no, mile 4, my hip begins to hurt a little bit right here. And she was pointing to the top of her iliac crest. I was like,
Hmm.
oh, okay. But after 4 miles,
Right.
that's a long time. That's not,
Yeah.
it's not like
Yeah.
a block. This is a long walk. And I know the neighborhood she lives in. And I was thinking, okay, in 4 miles, how many hills is she going to have and everything? And it's varied. There's nothing specific that it's like, okay, the last mile is all uphill. Nothing like that. It's very varied, all around. Okay. So I did my general assessment, uh, and started putting her through exercises. And I think second or third exercise was a simple bridge. And as she went into a bridge, I was doing an articulating bridge because I wanted to see if she could do a little bit of pelvic, movement. And when she went up, she goes, ooh. And I said, what's ooh? And she said, I felt like a lightning bolt go down my leg. And I went, stop. Okay.
Yeah.
I
Let's back
said,
off from that one.
we're going to stop for today. Her
Yeah.
husband was a physician. So I said, why don't you call
Mhm.
your husband and see if he can recommend getting into see an orthopedist? He wasn't an orthopedist, but he knew them. And she said, why? I feel fine. I said, I know. I said, humor me. I
Yeah.
said, what you just felt tells me that there's something else going on that isn't apparent. And, I don't have x-ray vision. I don't have MRI eyes. I can't see inside of you. I'd like to have a professional look at you and just see if there's something we're missing that's not apparent. Because later, what I found out is she has a very, very, very high tolerance for discomfort.
Mm.
So for her, she just basically moves past anything that's not comfortable. She's just like, I have no time for that. I'm going to go
Until it's an 8 or a 9. So she was
until
probably
it
feeling something on mile 1, but it wasn't until mile 4 that you'd go like, oh, okay, well, now I'm done.
exactly. And so I was like, all right, well, come to find out, she had a disc herniation, she had stenosis, and she had spondylolisthesis. So the stenosis was facet joint oriented, so it was lateral stenosis. And I
Yeah.
went, oh, you got the trifecta. Congratulations.
Yeah, exactly. You got them all.
And you have each one is conflicting as to where I need to put your pelvis.
Right, right, right.
So it's sort of like, okay, now what do we do? And actually, when I teach this in my courses and even with my staff, I said, she's actually easy. And they'll say, how could she be easy? It's like, find what works and causes no discomfort
And stay there and train
and
that.
stay there and
Period.
work
Whatever
there
it is.
first.
Like whatever
Yeah.
it is.
Because
Yeah.
I was thinking she probably had an upslipped pelvis or her QL was a little overactive or something. So getting her hip engaged a little bit would probably balance that out. Because my thought was at 4 miles, her glutes were probably too tired. She was probably not getting her glute med firing the way it should. Her low back was taking over. Her QL was probably getting overactive, and that was causing some discomfort. That was my initial thought. So I thought, oh, I'll start working more gluteal based. But this told me, no, we have to work everything. and we have
Yeah.
to train the heck out of stability of your core. So we find a position that your pelvis and your spine can be in that's comfortable, that you can maintain and stay there during all of these exercises, standing, sitting, leaning, planking, whatever we have you do. I want to make sure that you can do it. And got her on the reformer, got her on, the mat table, got her standing and doing all sorts of exercises. And she was a demon. And I got to tell you, within probably 3 weeks, she had almost no pain. She was completely fine. She was running circles around most of the people in here. And it's because she has that work ethic of, okay, let's do it. And she pushed as hard as she needed to. But I said, we want to stay pain-free range of motion. And then when we had her under control and we had her stable, we began to explore a little bit of pelvic movement, a little bit of
What
mobility.
ranges are tolerated?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just, okay, you can move here a little bit, no problem. You move here, maybe that bothers. Okay, we're going to avoid that. Because again, with spondylolisthesis, you usually want to keep them in a pretty significant posterior tilt. But we found for her, neutral to posterior was perfect. And she could be in traditional neutral with no problem. Extension is what bugged her.
Yeah.
And what happened during that bridge is at the top, she went into her aerobics class bridges and she went up to the top and arched her back.
Right.
And even as she did it, I said, okay, stop. And that's when she went, ooh. So I already saw, okay, the extension bothered her. I'm curious what might have caused what. But we realized, okay, she had multiple things. And we just had to figure out what was going to work for her to keep her stable today, train the living daylights out of that, and then begin to move forward into more three-dimensional training in all positions.
So that's a great story. It's a very typical story. One thing I want to really pull out of that story is typically a bridge is mildly painful. Like I've rarely had a client who's had a zing, like a nerve zing from a bridge. So one thing that I say a lot, and I'll use just a brief example in a minute, but one thing I say a lot is if something really is odd, and if you're a new teacher, you're not going to know what's odd. But after you've seen a few clients for the time, it's like, that's weird. Like that doesn't bother any of the other 200, 300, 500, 10,000 people I've tried that on. So what's happening here? Kind of like, if it looks like a duck and smells like a duck, it's probably a duck. But if it looks like a duck and smells like a cow, you got a problem. So in this case, like the fact that and also just a sudden nerve zing.
Yes.
Always is like giant red flag should show up in your brain immediately with anything having to do with the low back, especially if it's not something that's typical for them. Like I've had a number of clients who just have kind of chronic sciatica and we're used to where the edges are and where we have to pull back. But to have it like suddenly happen like that, that's like an immediate stop, red flag. We need to go get this checked out because when you're putting pressure on a nerve suddenly, you don't want to do that. So anyway, I just wanted to pull that piece out of that.
No, and that's exactly right. Is really when you do a bridge, like you said, we've done millions of bridges.
Yeah.
And unless they go so far up, and people are taught different things at different parts in their life. I remember you and I are both old enough to remember Jane Fonda days when people would do aerobics classes and they would at the top squeeze your butt, squeeze it hard. And they would go into a lordosis and they would arch their back really big. And they'd basically almost be in a wrestler's, bridge where they're on their neck. They're so high up.
Right.
Yeah. That's what they remember and that's what they're going to go into. So a lot of times we have to reteach it and, shorten their range of motion, keep it smaller and eventually get them up to the point where they can elongate their spine and do what needs to be done. So that's typical for me to see, especially if they've come from a physical therapist who's younger, who is more of a gym rat type of person who, wants to get their glutes firing. They're going to teach them to come up a little higher. And I may not want that. I may want them a little lower just to be safe. But you're right. You do 1,000 of these. Shouldn't bother anybody. It's usually a fairly safe position. So as soon as I got that, I thought, okay, we're stopping. And I want to give everybody out there permission to stop a session at any time.
Yeah.
If something happens like this, and again, this was, I'm going to say 10 years ago. So I'd been at this many, many, many years already. And rehab has been pretty much my entire stock and trade, my entire career doing post rehab work. So I've seen everything. And the fact that I immediately said, nope, we're done, we're stopping, that should say something. I always, if I'm at all in doubt, I will refer out. Because in the food chain, I realize I am a personal trainer. I do post rehabilitation work and I can help people. I can do a lot, but exercise is my go-to. That's what I do. I don't do physical therapy. I don't do any of that.
That's our modality. That's what we've
That's
got.
our modality. That's what we
That's
do.
what we're trained in. Yeah.
Yeah. So guess what? I'm going to send her to someone who has other modalities and have them make the diagnosis, because we don't diagnose and we don't provide treatment. We're just helping manage conditions through exercise. So it's an easy way for me that when I see something like that, it's like, okay, if, like you said, if it seems odd and isn't quite right, get a second opinion or a third opinion. Don't hesitate. Don't think that we should know it all. Too many people feel as though if I send them to their doctor, they're never going to be back and I'm going to lose a client. No, the opposite happens. They become a client for life.
They trust you, and they'll send people
Bingo.
to you because they know they can trust you. So 2 funky examples that I just want to throw in here for kind of the same vein, then I'll have you go on to another case study. I've had 2 clients. Actually, one was a Pilates teacher that I know. Another one was a client. Another one is a client that I've heard about. All of whom had low back pain. 2 of them, and this is the important piece, had a history of cancer. So one of them had breast cancer.
Ding.
One of them had testicular cancer when they were, relatively young in terms of testicular cancer. And then they started to have low back pain. And in one of the cases, this is actually one of my instructors was telling me about it. One of them was like, she's dealing with low back pain. Nothing's changing. And finally, like we talked and I said, hey, if it feels weird, if like things are not resolving, have her go back to her doctor. And there was a spot on her spine. We don't know what it was yet, but it's kind of like, you don't know. And then, this instructor that I know, similar thing. He was like, I got this funky low back pain. Finally went back to his oncologist, got a, PET scan or whatever. And was like, oh yeah, it's because you've got tumors in your spine. So I don't want to scare you with that necessarily, but low back pain is a sign of many different kinds of cancer, pancreatic cancer, any kind of bone cancer, multiple myeloma, things like all some organ things manifest as that. Autoimmune things can manifest as that. So if low back pain
ovarian
following, ovarian for sure, right? Anything in that area, uterine fibroids I've had cause low back pain.
Oh, big time.
Yeah, or chronic endometriosis, like a lot of digestive issues, people with Crohn's disease and that kind of stuff. So sometimes it's not myofascial, it's not physical. It's coming from the organs, or it's coming from another situation. And if things really aren't resolving at all in the time frame you're used to, and you aren't, if you're an instructor, you're not going to know what that is. But feel free to send them back. Send them, say, hey, this feels funny to me. Go talk to your doctor, go have them. And I've had to have a couple of clients where I just push them because they're like, I'm fine. It's like, no, I'm not going to see you again until you go to see your doctor because something just doesn't smell right to me. And in both cases, they went back to their doctor and things were found that needed to be found. So sometimes you are their frontline medical person because you're seeing them once or twice a week.
Yes.
The medical professionals seeing them every 6 months or every year or whatever, and they're not really paying attention because they got 15 minutes right? So just know that sometimes you are that frontline person, and it's not to put extra pressure on you, but just know that is a role that you may end up playing at some point.
We all do. Very similar to those 2 cases. I had one that happened to a wonderful, wonderful client of mine who I got her directly after breast cancer. So she had just had her double mastectomy and was going to have reconstruction, and then we were going to start. I said, okay, cool. And I'd seen her for years after that, years and years. She came back from skiing and she had greater trochanteric pain right in her hip. Okay, which kind of makes sense. She was very, very thin and long legs and so I said, could be a couple of things, including bursitis. Why don't you go to the doctor, get it taken a look at? But if I stretched her in certain ways, it relieved a lot of the discomfort. So I would always stretch it, but I kept saying, I want you to go. I want you to go. 3 years went by. And finally I said, I'm done. I said, until you get this taken a look at, I said, we're fighting it every week. I can stretch it, no problem, but it's not resolving. So I want you to go. Worst case scenario, what? They're going to give you a shot of cortisone. So please go. She went in, diagnosed with bursitis, shot of cortisone. Great. Didn't resolve anything. And so I said, go back. I'm not seeing you until you go back. She went back. Doctor wanted an MRI. She calls me up. I'm not going. I'm not going. I said, go or I'm not going to see you. I'm serious. She went in. She called me up and her exact words were, you may have just saved my life. I said, what's up? And she said, I have a neuroendocrine tumor the size of a softball that's pushing on that joint. Yeah. And I said, yeah. And again, this is early in my career, so I wasn't as tuned to think about those type of things. And unfortunately, she didn't live another 4 months. It was that progressed. Yeah. And do I regret not pushing to get her in sooner? Yes, but I can only do so much. And I did say every week, I want you to get this looked at, please. And it wasn't until I threatened not to. And again, we're not trying to scare anybody here. Just understand that when you look, when you hear hooves, we often think of horses, not zebras. But guess what? Occasionally it's a zebra.
Right, exactly.
So have someone who has that foresight and can look into things, especially if they have a history of something else that has nothing to do with what we do.
Yeah.
Have them take a look at it because you never know. You'd never know.
Better to be wrong and have nothing be wrong. I mean, much better, right? Than for them to find a tumor or, some other thing going on.
Much better to just be a waste of time. It's like, okay, you wasted an afternoon.
Sorry, and a copay. Sorry.
Exactly. Precisely. Well, I teased this case study. It's an interesting one. Okay. He contacted me. He's a big time golfer. He has EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Am I saying that correctly?
Hypermobility stuff. Yeah.
Hypermobility. Okay. So does his daughter. But he has it. He has a major, and this is going to sound familiar, major shearing at the TL junction, thoracic lumbar junction, which is
shearing. So like, we're moving. Those bones are moving more than they should.
Anterior, posterior. And I have that. And it is unbelievably painful. When I first met you, I was suffering from that pretty bad. And I was really limiting how much I could move because I needed to stay very tight and I had to stabilize like crazy.
Yeah. And not move much.
And took me about 10 years to really get past that. And it's not 100%. Mine was caused from my weight issue from the past. But his was caused by the hypermobility. And I always tell people that area is kind of like two puzzle pieces that aren't 100% perfect. Yeah, they're not 100%, yeah, it's like a child trying to force two puzzle pieces together. You can make it fit, but it's not designed. Well, this is kind of like that. And so when he came to me, fortunately, I had spent the last 10 years learning all about the thoracic, spine for my own, because I wanted to help myself, so I was like, okay, I actually got you. I can help this out a lot. And because anytime he went into any type of extension, it immediately sheared. And he says, it feels like a knife being stabbed in my spine. And I know exactly what he feels when he does that. So for us, it was all about stabilize that whole area, get him so that he doesn't overwork that area because he was a golfer. He was doing a lot of lumbar shearing as well, rotationally, a lot of torque. He was trying to get, like a lot of golfers, he was trying to get just a few more yards, so a few more degrees in his rotation. Yeah, just a little bit more. And I said,
a little bit more.
You got to stop that. We got to limit and
stop pushing.
Get it tighter, because he's a good golfer. Get it a little tighter. And when he was ready, and again, I wanted to strengthen his erectors, but I needed to do it much more in a static position. So like a statue or
Right.
isometrically.
Lots of neutral with like load coming from different angles, or moving the torso forward, moving the torso back, and having it just almost isometrically just
100%.
activate, right?
Yep.
Rather than concentrically compressing or moving things. Yeah.
Yeah. And we really focused the most on that, trying to get him to feel that area and to be able to hold it in place. And then once I got that, I said, okay, now we need to start working a little bit on upper thoracic extension, because
Mm.
he was a politician kind of person. He was in government. And so he was rounded a lot, sitting at a
Yeah.
desk. He had good posture
Yeah.
when he stood, but he had a little bit of that hunch.
Yeah. Just
So
desk posture.
exactly. So up against the wall, lift toes and nose, I call it, both arms up overhead, lifting one arm back at a time, getting the lower trapezius to fire, trying to retrain some of the upper thoracic muscles, what their job is, how to do it properly, without going overboard, working on thoracic rotation, which he was pretty good at, actually. Not great, but he was pretty good. Once we were stable first, then over a ball, I'd have him go into neutral spine, and he wasn't in extension, but he wasn't in flexion. He was just at that neutral and holding his body erect, arms out in front of him, taking it up to a Y position and back down again. So I was challenging strength as he lifted the arms isometrically. And then I would tell him, I want you half a degree. I want you to go into
Mm.
extension, not of your lumbar. And I
Just
had
a
him feel
bit.
his upper. I started working on a lot of retraction in the head so he could feel the upper thoracic moving. I said, okay, now I want 1 degree, half a degree.
Right. Right. Right.
And in doing that, we began to increase his thoracic extension slightly in the upper region while stabilizing the lower region and keeping him in a slight posterior tilt. I found a slight posterior tilt helped elongate a little bit of that lumbar spine that just gave him a little more strength and stabilization. He's very strong now. I'm able to do almost anything I want with him. He actually just moved into, he's going to winter somewhere else. So he was like, will you talk to a trainer there? And I was like, how do I explain this? How do I explain this to someone that they're not going to ruin everything that we've just built? It's kind of like, okay, I built this incredible house. Okay, let's have, a WWE wrestler and all his friends go and tear the place apart.
And
I
have a
just,
party.
and have a party. And they love to do HIIT training and everything. I'm like, okay, let me talk to her and
Yeah.
put big time parameters on this.
Yes.
Yeah,
Don't
I said,
do these things.
here's your box. I said, overhead movements are no, 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 no. She went, oh, not at all. I said, pull downs he can do. Don't ever lift overhead. Not for now. Again, if I was watching, I know what I'm looking for. Do I trust that? I don't know how good her eye is. She may be amazing. I just don't know the woman. Don't know her.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
not going to, I'd rather go without
Err on the
trust for
side of
now.
caution. Err on
Yeah.
caution.
And, so I was explaining what we wanted to avoid with a lot of thoracic extension. But at the same time, I had to talk to him and say, okay, you and I have worked now for the last 7, 8 months on getting you to this point. I said, you have incredible awareness of where your spine is. I need you to be responsible and not to give her that responsibility. I need you to be responsible for your body because it is your body. Don't
Yeah.
allow someone else to tell you to do something. If your brain, if your gut, if anything inside of you is saying, maybe I shouldn't don't do it. I said, I want to give you that permission. And I told her the same thing. And I said, I told him this. If he feels anything, he's to stop immediately. And she actually thanked me. She said, thank you, because I don't want to hurt him. I said, I know you don't. You're here to help. And I respect that. But he needs to take responsibility and not assume that, oh, I'm going to turn over responsibility now and I don't have to think about this. So I really pushed that responsibility aspect on him. And it seems to be working so far. I'm cautiously optimistic. I still see him virtually once every couple of weeks. And it's like, okay, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I worry. But that's what I did for this client. And again, it's an odd case because it's not something that you're going to see often. Believe me, I asked a lot of
Yeah.
PTs about it and none of them knew what I was
I'm
talking
like,
about when I
huh?
explained my pain. I was like, "Ugh, I wish I could be more specific, but yeah." So, yeah. So, an interesting case study, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things to bring out about that. One is if they're seeing two people, in this case, this other person, and you have been like refining their program in a very high way. Because I think about several clients that I
Yeah.
worked with at when I was at my own studio and at St. Francis, where we finally figured out what worked. Like these are the parameters. We can do this every time
Yep.
and things make progress. We do this and things go downhill and you've got like a month-long recovery time. So it's kind
Yep.
of like, this is the deal. And the chart would be like, do this program. Right. Because we shared soap notes at that studio. And it was always like, this all, don't do anything else. Don't get creative. Don't have a good time. Just do this. Right.
Yeah.
Especially if I'm gone for a couple of weeks. Right. And I know I'm going to come back. Like, don't ruin it while I'm gone. So that was certainly one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is interesting because even in my facility, we share clients.
Yeah.
So I may see
Yeah.
a client once a week or once every 2 weeks, and someone else may see them more often. I'm sort of the one who's doing the primary programming or whatnot, or at least keeping an overwatch position
Hmm.
on the person
Yeah.
so I can keep an eye on it and then eventually turn them over, hopefully 100% to someone else. But yeah, when you're doing that, being as clear as possible with the instructions and
Yeah.
to have parameters and say, here's what they are allowed to do and here's what they are not allowed to do. And I
Yeah.
sent him down there with specific exercises and said, here are your exercises. If you do nothing else
This is
but
it.
these,
This
you'll
is
be
your list.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can play all the golf you want and it's going to be great because he just retired. So he wants to play more golf, but he wants the social aspect of going and doing, these
Yeah.
classes and everything. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe. I said, you just listen to your body. If they have you do anything that you're even questioning a little bit, modify. Just don't do it.
So two other pieces to bring out there. One is finding what works and stabilizing the heck out of it. A lot of
Mhm.
times with low back, and that was exactly like I think of that as that was a wonderful 3-step progression, right? This is what hurts. Figuring that out first, right? This is what's happening. Then trying to stabilize like mad. And then once the stabilization is relatively stable and they can maintain that and they can work with that, then you start to very slowly build those parameters out of mobility. Like low back,
Mhm.
that is classic. And don't forget any of those stages, particularly in my experience, don't forget that stage. And we talked about this last time of moving them past
Yeah.
their box
Yep.
slowly, carefully, so that's one thing. The second thing was making them responsible for their pain and for
Yes.
managing their own experience. I was just talking to a bunch of instructors about this and just the challenge of clients who really are like, oh, just fix me,
Yep.
and they really are not willing to do stuff. And we talked about, and this also came out of working with a friend of mine, Lindy Royer, on modern pain science stuff, is like, sometimes, and I think a lot of the male trainers I know are better at this than the female trainers. Sorry, I'm just going to throw that out there. But with a client with pain, whatever their pain is, there's some really good questions to ask them. One of them is, are you willing, what are you willing to give up to decrease your pain? Like in this guy's case, it might be I don't want you to play golf for 2 weeks. Or, I've
Mhm.
got a runner with a bad knee. I say, okay, I don't want you to run for, a couple of weeks till we see how we do, whatever it is. You're willing to give something up. And then what are you willing to do? Like, how much time do you have? How much are you willing to do in terms of a home program or changing
Mhm.
your ergonomics or whatever? So understanding kind of what their expectations are. And then that's also your opportunity to say, with this condition, I'm thinking about this client you're talking about, once a week probably wasn't going to make the difference.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, he needed like maybe once a week would kind of maybe keep him at some level, maybe
Yep.
slow progress, but he either needed to do more than once a week with you, or he needed to do some version of a home program to reinforce those habits.
Yes.
Right. And like so many low back pain clients, like I can't do it once a week.
No.
I'll do my best, but we're not going to get there with once a week. I need just 5 minutes of your time on 2 other days to do these couple things so we can make progress. And I think setting
Yes.
those expectations up with your clients is really important at the beginning. So I just
Yep.
want to throw that out there with anybody in pain, particular back pain. You
With
know?
I think I've mentioned this and I'll say it again. When I do my assessments with someone, I can't tell you how many times I will have someone say, "Well, how long do I have to do this for? Or when can I stop doing this?" And I say, "Well, as soon as you want the pain to come back." And the look on their face is like, "Oh." And I'll say, "Yeah." I said, "This is something that you may or may not be managing for a longer period of time than you think. It may go
Mhm.
away entirely, and that's the goal. We'd love for that to happen. Nothing more than to have that happen. However, most of the clients we work with are probably over 50, probably had a desk job most of their life and are not former athletes. So they're not the people that are going to be, I got to solve this. I'm going to work out 3, times a day. They're the type
Yeah.
that don't want to do anything. And they're the ones that I say, look, here's your homework and you have a choice. You can't come in once a week to see me. I know I'm expensive. I get that. You can come in once a week, but I need you to do this every day at home. Here's 20 minutes of exercises every single day. If you are not willing to do that, then you need to come in here 4 times a week. Those are your 2 choices. And they look at me like, "Oh." And I'll say, "It's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do." I said, "But as a businessman, I'm not going to say no to 4 times a week. You want me to be responsible for all of that? Come on in. But I'm going to tell you this. I can't be. You have to take responsibility. And I want you to start doing these exercises because the more you do them, the more you understand about your body. And I'm going to teach you about your
Mhm.
body, the
Yeah.
more you can do in your life." And that usually wakes them up a little bit and they say, "Oh, okay." And I've only had one person walk in after 2 weeks and throw their exercises down and said, "I'm not going to do these at home. I'll come in 4 to 5 times a week." Okay.
Okay.
That's your choice. I mean, like I said, as a businessman, I'm not going to turn you away, but only one. Everyone else did the exercises. And something that you guys need to think about, and I know Nora does this with hers, you got to keep them accountable to doing the exercises.
And like, this is one of the things that I've always loved about working with you, Brian, and also actually, honestly, and don't take this the wrong way, anybody out there, but with a lot of my male trainers and my male Pilates teachers, and some of my females, but not so much. It's like that clarity for a client. That's honesty.
Mm-hmm.
That's not you trying to make a buck. That's like, if you want to actually fix this, low back pain is not going to be solved by 1 hour out of the week. And the rest of
Nope.
the time going back to whatever your old habits are. It just, for the most part, isn't. Like,
Nope.
really, it just rarely will that solve the problem. And so the reality is, you've got a couple of options. You can do some homework. You can come in several times. That's what's actually going to make the difference. And so, and I think,
Yep.
for any of you who are either beginning teachers or even not beginning teachers, being that honest with your rehab clients, it makes everything easier. Because then,
Yeah.
like, the challenge I had, certainly as a young teacher, was I wouldn't kind of put those laws down until they already knew me for a while. I was the nice teacher. I was super kind. I was very encouraging. And so at that point, like 3 months in, when I try to put the hammer down and go, "You've got to start doing these," they look at me like, "Why are you being so mean to me?" I'm also a woman, so that's always different. Those relationships are just plain different.
Yeah. There.
And so, now it's kind of like, okay, so this is the deal. I'm happy to work with you. If the situation got going on, I think we can manage it, but this is what it will take on your part. Are you willing to do that? And then be
Yes.
honestly willing to take a no.
Yeah.
If they say, like, your client, I mean, some of my clients have said, like, I'm not going to do this. I said, well, great, then go off and find some other modality, because I'm not going to work with you.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to be willing to hold some of that line. And I just want to encourage all of you out there to think about that line, especially
Yeah.
with your rehab clients, because it just makes, it's like that's going to make the difference between success for them and success for you. You're not just
Yes.
coddling them in their codependent state for the rest of time. You're actually trying to make progress. And it
Yeah,
takes a little bit of that to make progress. So anyway.
it does. It does. And like I say, if you're willing to hold them accountable, and every time they come in, you've been doing your homework,
Yeah.
and if they say, oh, this has been a busy week, not as much. And a lot of times, here's how I've described it to both clients and staff is, all right, well, you haven't done the exercises on your own, so we're going to have to do the boring stuff. And you're going to have to eat your broccoli in front of me before we can get to your dessert. And they'll go, okay. Because they know I don't want to do the boring exercises. I don't want to
Right.
do the stuff on the mat
Bridging
table. I
and
want to go
toe
have
taps.
fun.
Exactly. You want to
Yeah,
do something more exciting.
exactly. And if they're going to do all of that at home, and again,
Yeah.
15, 20 minutes, then I know they've built up that foundation and I can check on them occasionally with it and be like, yeah, you're rocking this. Keep going. And we'll change this exercise to this one. Okay. Keep rocking that. And we can have more fun, but
Awesome.
you got to keep them accountable. And
Okay.
I will say this, I learned this when doing radio.
Hmm.
I had an incredible instructor in doing commercials is he said, I want you to do the commercial and I want you to smile. So what do you mean? He said, smile while you're doing the commercial. People will hear your smile. I said, are you out your mind? People are going to hear me smile. And he recorded two things and, said, listen to both and tell me which one I'm smiling. And I could hear it. And it wasn't that he was bouncy in his voice. I said, all right. And how I use that now is I say things, but I say things with a smile.
Yes,
And I
exactly.
joke, but at the
Yes.
same time, I'm serious. So when I say, as soon as you want the pain to come back, I'm smiling. And usually they'll be like, oh. And I say, and I'm not joking. But I say it with a smile on my face. So they get that, okay. And that's when I then get a little bit more serious, but I started out with that smile. So there's the friendliness. It's not me bringing the hammer down all the time because nobody
Right.
wants
Right. Right.
that.
No.
Nobody wants that, but you can do it with a smile. You can do it with kind eyes. You can do it. Again, I think you and I both come from a place of genuine care from our heart for the people that are working with us, and they can feel that.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, this is what I want you to do. And if you're not willing to do it, then you're not willing to get better. And I want you to get better. And if you explain it, a lot of times they say, okay. And they will, hopefully, you can move them in the right direction. Sometimes it takes a little poking and prodding, carrot or the stick. Sometimes you need both, and sometimes a really big stick. But, hold them accountable. It makes a difference.
So I want to just as a close up, I think that's important, guys. Just so you know, that kind of can make or break your job as a post rehab movement person. Right? Really, all that's really critical. But I want to bring up just one last little case study, and this is a couple of clients that I've been working with a lot lately. These are both people who are tight enough in their hip flexors or anterior hip that they actually don't have full extension. They don't have full hip extension.
Mm-hmm.
So if they go into a neutral hip, like their legs right underneath them, their low back goes into lordosis. Like there's that teeter-totter between the hips moving or the femurs moving into extension and the low back coming into lordosis. And those things are always working together. And it's been interesting working with both of them because one of them doesn't really have any issues, so she's fine. We just work on mobility and getting that length and stuff. But particularly in Pilates, I've had to really modify a lot of things to accommodate for the fact that they don't have that extension. For example, neither of them, if they're lying flat on the ground and trying to do like a leg lift, which is a very typical exercise, right? Fully prone leg lift, they have no range at all.
Yeah.
Or they have like what I call the little mouse tunnel under their hips. They have to start in flexion and kind of with a little space under there to be able to get any movement at all. So being aware of that with your clients with low back pain, if that's an issue, it's like slowly working on developing the range, if possible, in those hip flexors, and then really accommodating and managing their hip extension so they're not going into the place where they're compressing the lumbar spine with lordosis.
Mm-hmm.
So For example, supine feed-in straps on particularly the trap table, because you can go pretty low on the trap table. I found for both of them that when they go down, they'll go to a certain point, and then rather than letting the low back go into lordosis, they'll bend their knees to bring the straps down a little bit farther, right? So they'll substitute knee flexion for hip extension. And I sort of know that I was watching them going, okay. And then I would say, okay, now let's try to really keep your knees straight. And that was really hard. And then they couldn't go as low. So things like that, like also being aware of where their low back is, any of you know me, like that supported neutral, using some support under the low back. So they can feel when they start to move away from that and go into lordosis. People don't know where their low back is. Talk about this in terms of neutral, in terms of all that. It's not touching anything. Anything that's not touching anything doesn't have a lot of feedback. So that's just one of the things I just wanted to mention in terms of people who have a sensitivity to extension, is you've really got to look and see what's happening in the low back, what's happening in the hip extension, and then really modify exercises so they're not going into that range, which really causes compression either in the low back or in the SI joints. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there as a pretty typical thing I see a lot, and need to really accommodate and change the exercise choices I'm making for that.
And it's very, like you said, it's very common, and it may not be something that can be changed easily, quickly, or for some
Maybe a
at
while
all.
or ever. It may just be their hip structure.
I've had one person I'm thinking of right now, been years, and every time she lies down, her knees are so far up off the table. Oh my gosh. But I put her into a hip flexor stretch, and it's not that tight. It doesn't look like it's that tight. It is, but it doesn't have that appearance necessarily. She has function in a lot of other ways. So she's able to compensate in so many different ways that we have to really modify to keep her safe. Or else she's going to fall into those compensatory patterns.
One other little trick that I sometimes do is if I'm having somebody go into that extension. So one other thing to throw out here is if somebody has a big butt, has a lot of gluteal mass, that'll also get in the way of their hip extension. So it may not be that they're actually tight in their hip flexors, it's that their butt gets in the way when they try to go into extension. And so that also can lead to that. So that's where that, support in the low back. I've also had people, for example, on the trap table, lie on a box, long box, and have the edge of the box on their sacrum. So the gluteal mass is off the end of the box. And their feet in the straps, and then they can often find more range because the tightening of the glutes to bring the legs into hip extension doesn't immediately push their pelvis up because of increased gluteal mass and change how that whole hip dynamic works. So anyway, I just wanted to throw those little tidbits out because those are also very low back related, and something that, especially in Pilates, we don't always pay attention to because there's such a focus on flexion and full range of motion, that kind of thing.
I think something to also mention, though, that you and I think of as automatic, when you do something like that, you do have to modify the springs and make sure they're heavier, because now they're having to hold up that gluteal mass as well that was on the table, which is now suspended. So sometimes someone with big gluteal mass is also going to have big old legs. So
right, exactly. You got to have a little extra help, a little extra support.
Yeah. So we covered a lot today.
Yeah, it was fun to do some case study stuff and to bring out, I think a lot of things got brought out, like red flags and things to look for, and flexion versus extension, stability. And then just, some common things that you see. And then also just that whole point of making a client responsible and accountable. Because I think all that's are really pieces of that whole working with any client with a rehab issue.
And I think it's something that we need to be reminded about sometimes. So I think it's always good to sort of remind everyone and say, you know what, we're not responsible for everything they do. We see them 1 to 3 times, hours a week. There's still 160 some odd hours that they're on their own that they have to be responsible for. So, we can't take everything. So,
exactly.
Well, thank you guys very much for listening to us. As always, you can reach us at our Gmail at movingconvos@gmail.com. Check us out on Instagram at Moving Convos, Moving Conversations on Facebook. And For Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We'll see y'all next week.
Bye, guys.